7:02. I think we'll go ahead and start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Maria Mitchell Association Summer Science Speaker Series. I'm Regina Jorgensen. I'm the director of the Maria Mitchell Observatory, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm going to start off first quickly by thanking our sponsors for tonight's event, which include Bank of America, Cape Air, the White Elephant, and Cisco Brewers. And thank you for their support for making tonight's event happen. And I'll just put in a little plug that you can join us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. throughout the summer for our Science Speaker Series talks. And one other thing I'll just say before we begin is that we will be holding questions until the end. If you do have questions during the talk, I would encourage you to write them in the Q&A function, which you should find somewhere down at the bottom of your screen. You could type your question in there at any point, and we'll take all the questions at the end. So with that, it's actually my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Meredith MacGregor, who is an assistant professor of Astrophysical and Planetary Sciences at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her research programs leverage multi-wavelength observations to explore the formation and potential habitability of planetary systems. She's a regular user of some of the world's most powerful telescopes, including the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array, also known as ALMA, and she serves as the co-chair of the NASA Infrared Science Interest Group. Before joining the faculty at CU Boulder, Dr. McGregor won a prestigious National Science Foundation Astronomy and Astrophysics postdoctoral fellowship, which she held at the Carnegie Institute for Science. Prior to that, Dr. McGregor earned her PhD from Harvard University, where her dissertation work was entitled Millimeter Studies of Nearby Debris Disks. And Dr. McGregor is not only a leader in her field, but also has a very special connection to the Maria Mitchell Association, as she first came here as an undergraduate student as part of our National Science Foundation Research Experiences for Undergraduates program. And I'm really delighted to welcome her back again this summer as an affiliated astronomer. And I'd like to thank her for participating in our program now as a mentor to one of our current REU interns. And we're really, really honored to have you as part of our program again this summer. And also, I'd like to thank you for spending the evening with us and talking about your research. And I'm really, really excited to hear your talk. So welcome. And I will stop screen sharing and turn it over to you now. Let me stop that share.
Okay, perfect. Great. So let me get my screen share going and switch into presentation mode. Okay, perfect. So hopefully everybody can see that and hear me okay. I am really excited to get to talk tonight about space weather and specifically stellar flares. And we're going to focus on our nearest exoplanetary neighbor, which is Proxima Centauri. So that's a lot of jargon, and I'm going to spend a good part of the beginning of this talk actually kind of stepping through motivating why we would care about this and how we do this kind of science. But let me start with a few sort of acknowledgements. As Regina said, I was an intern at Maria Mitchell back in many years ago when I was an RU student in undergrad. And Maria Mitchell's always held a special place in my heart because it was my first real experience doing research as an undergrad. And that's been absolutely instrumental to my career in astrophysics. And so I dug up these pictures, which are, my intern cohort back when we traveled and went to places in person. But this was back when I was an undergrad here. Okay, a few other acknowledgements quickly. I'm going to show a lot of different work and recent results today, and I want to take a moment and acknowledge everybody that's worked on this with me. Astronomers are not islands, we work in teams. And these are the names of many of my collaborators. Everybody in blue is a student or postdoc, so they're early career people who have been involved in this research. And I want to draw kind of special attention to my own research group, which I've been building here at CU Boulder. I started here in January of 2020, so we've had a fun pandemic time build of a research group. But what we work on here is trying to do astronomical observations and use those to understand how stars and disks and planets interact. And we use those observations to kind of answer 3 questions that I've put here. We really are trying to kind of understand how planetary systems form, whether we can use, structure in these giant disks to look for planets, what's happening with the stars, can we understand what the planets are made out of, and really with the bigger picture question of looking at astrobiology and trying to understand what the possibilities are for life in the universe. And I'm quite thrilled that I have not only myself, who is a Mariah Mitchell intern alum in my research group, but 2 other alums. Kiana Burton, pictured here, was an undergrad last year through Mariah Mitchell and is now going to be a grad student in my group here at CU in the fall. And Jay Chadihi was a Mariah Mitchell RU student several years ago and is now also a grad student in my group. So we're like building a little Mariah Mitchell powerhouse here at CU Boulder. Okay, so let's start talking about science. And what I want to start with is a broad definition of habitability. This is a term that gets tossed around in astrophysics all the time. What exactly is habitability? So most astronomers will say that a planet is habitable if it hosts the ingredients and conditions that are necessary for life. And usually we narrow that definition even more. And by saying ingredients, what we really mean is water, because our Earth is 70% water and all life on Earth is largely water-based. And then that means that the conditions are, we want this planet to be warm enough to allow for liquid water. We can't have it too hot because the water would boil off, and we can't have it too cold because water would freeze. So habitability then means we are looking for planets in the universe that are full of water and they're at the right temperature where that water can be a liquid. Okay, an important caveat to remember here is that when we talk about habitability, we are just asking about whether a planet, at this point in time, right, like where we are in research right now, we're just trying to understand whether a planet has the conditions that might allow life to arise and survive on that planet. And we're not actually asking whether it harbors life at this time, right? This definition of habitability just says, could there be life here at all? It doesn't really ask, is there life here right now? Okay. So with that in mind, usually we define what's called a habitable zone. So we go out and we look at exoplanets, planets around other stars, and we determine how far they are from their host star, the distance from the star. And we define something that's called a habitable zone. Essentially, this star is hot and it radiates out into space and it heats up everything surrounding it. Things that are close to the star get heated up more than things that are farther away. And there's some kind of sweet spot, Goldilocks zone, habitable zone, where the temperature of a planet that I might stick down orbiting the sun would be just right to allow it to have liquid water. So I'm turning that definition of habitable, being at the right temperature to allow for liquid water, into kind of a radius range where we could look for planets and they might be that right temperature. So oftentimes you'll see in the news, astronomers saying like, we discovered a new habitable zone planet or a new potentially habitable world. And really all that means is we have found a planet that is the right distance from its star where it could possibly have liquid water on the surface of that planet. Okay, so we have some basic definitions. There are some caveats, obviously, right? That is a pretty simple statement to make, that it could have liquid water. And one catch is that different stars actually have different habitable zones. So we have a sun, which is our central star, and that's kind of this case here in the middle. The sun, as we're going to talk about in the next few slides, is a pretty average star. It's not too exciting. There are much hotter stars in the universe, and there are much colder stars in the universe. And as you might expect, when you heat up the star, that habitable zone actually moves outwards. It gets further away. And if you cool the star down, that habitable zone moves inwards. So it's not quite so simple to just look for planets at the same distance from all of their stars, because there's lots of different types of stars in the universe, and each of those types of stars has a different habitable zone. Okay, so what do I mean by different types of stars? I want everybody to take a minute and look at this image on the right. So this image is a really beautiful deep field image taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. And the Hubble Space Telescope is an amazing instrument. And what is in this field is a whole bunch of stars. Everything in this image is a star. And all of these stars are about the same distance away. They're about 25,000 light years away. So if you look at this image, I want you to take a moment and think, do all of these stars look the same? And if not, what may or may not be different about them? So you might have noticed that some of these stars look kind of red. Some of them look kind of yellow. Some of them even look a little bit blue. Some of them seem to be brighter. Some of them seem to be a little bit less bright. So clearly, even though all of these are stars and they're all at the exact same distance from us, they are not all the same. And that is where we come to different types of stars. So essentially, stars have different masses, they weigh different amounts, and as a result, they have very different temperatures, which translates into having different colors and different brightnesses or luminosities. So some stars are really, really hot and bright, and those are these sort of big, bright blue stars here. And some stars are much fainter and much cooler, which are these sort of orange and red looking stars in the picture. So usually astronomers then kind of try and show this graphically, and that's what's called the HR diagram or Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. So this is just a very complicated looking plot that's showing the brightness of stars on the y-axis right here, and the temperature of stars on the x-axis. And all stars that we know of lie on a diagonal line that goes from the upper left side of this plot to the lower right. We'll just sort of ignore the things that are off of those. Those are evolved stars, exotic things are happening there. But for our purposes, all stars that might host planets are lying along this diagonal line. Now, our sun is right here in the middle. It is what we call a G-type star. It's a kind of totally normal average star. Everything up here, these blue stars, are much bigger, and they're much brighter, and they're much hotter, right? So we can look at the sun here, it's maybe about 6,000 degrees. Stars up here are 30,000 degrees, so they're a factor of 5 hotter. And we can go to the other end of this plot, the lower right. These are what we call M-type stars, or M-dwarf stars. These are our little tiny red friends, and they are much cooler, right? So these stars are somewhere around 3,000 degrees in temperature, and correspondingly much fainter. Okay, so this is the sort of picture of stars in the universe, in our galaxy. And just so you get a sense for what that diagram looks like in actual scale, this is showing different stars to scale. So Betelgeuse and Aldebaran are two stars that are way up here in this plot. They're what we call supergiant stars and giant stars. They are evolved stars. So stars on this main diagonal will eventually turn into stars up here. And they're huge. So we can't even fit all of Betelgeuse in this little to scale graphic. Our sun is this little tiny speck here. And then if we blow that up by 100, now we have our sun. We have our Earth for comparison, and we have a little tiny white dwarf, Procyon b, which is actually about the same size as our typical M-dwarf star. So, orders of magnitude, so many orders of magnitude and differences in scales that I can't even show them to you in one graphic. Shows you just kind of how different these different types of stars are. Okay, so let's bring this back around to the habitable zone, right? We want to find these planets that are at the right temperature to have liquid water, and where we look for them then depends on the type of star. So this is showing the temperature of stars again, and now distance from that star, and the green is where that habitable zone would be for different temperature stars. So we pick out our sun right here, 5 to 6,000 degrees Kelvin. This is where our Earth is, and this is where the habitable zone is. So we are nice and lucky here on Earth. We sit right in the middle of the habitable zone of our star, which means conditions are perfect on Earth, obviously, for there to be liquid water. Stars that are more luminous, brighter, hotter, have wider habitable zones, and they're farther away. So you can see if I pick this star up here at 7,000 degrees Kelvin, even Earth is not actually in the habitable zone of a hotter star like that. I'd have to look much further away. in order to find a potentially habitable planet. And if I go all the way down here to one of these little M dwarfs, now this habitable zone is really close to the star and it's really narrow. So again, Earth would not be habitable around one of these types of stars. So we're getting a little bit of the complexity here. Okay. Now, I'm going to add in an extra tidbit of information. Stars, including our own sun, are what we call active. And that means that the star has a magnetic field, and that magnetic field actually gets sort of twisted up in the star. So you can kind of think of the star as like a ball of plasma and its surface is moving around. And as the surface moves around, the magnetic field of that star gets all tangled, you know, like a ball of yarn getting twisted up. When that happens, it eventually creates tension because you're taking these magnetic field lines and you're twisting them and twisting them and twisting them. And eventually they snap because they can't contain that energy anymore. When that happens is what's called a flare, where the star actually releases a huge burst of radiation that streams outwards from the star and rushes towards any planets nearby it. Sometimes those bursts of radiation or flares are also accompanied by something called a coronal mass ejection, or a CME, which is now charged particles accompanying it as well. So we have our star on an active magnetic field, things are twisting up, they're snapping, and then these stars are releasing their flares, these bursts of high energy radiation, and their CMEs, these bursts of energetic particles, and those all stream outwards, and they impact the atmosphere and magnetic field of any planets that might be surrounding that star. So this graphic is showing how these energy is coming and it's impacting this side of a planetary magnetic field. It's actually restructuring the planet's magnetic field. And some of those particles and some of that energy might penetrate the magnetic field and it might come into the atmosphere of the planet. And when that happens, this energy is high enough, it's high enough energy radiation that it can actually come into the atmosphere and it can start splitting molecules. So our atmosphere has a lot of water in it, has a lot of ozone. These flare energy can kind of come in and it can hit an ozone molecule and it can split it apart. So instead of being O3, 3 oxygen atoms bound together in ozone, it will split it into 3 individual ozone atoms. Or it might take water and split it into 2 individual hydrogens and an oxygen. Those individual atoms are really light, which means that they can actually just escape from atmospheres completely. And so if you have enough of these flares, we can have something that's called atmospheric erosion, which basically means all of this energy comes in, it splits apart all of these nice big heavy molecules that are hanging out in your atmosphere, splits them into tiny little atoms that then escape, and you lose part of your atmosphere. And if you had enough of this, you could basically strip away the entire atmosphere of a planet. So this sounds really bad, right? No one really wants this to happen. We don't want our atmosphere to get eroded because the atmosphere is what we breathe. The atmosphere protects us from some of the harmful radiation from the sun. Having an atmosphere is clearly important for life on a planet. We can actually see this happening in our own solar system, right? Our sun has these types of flares. And when those radiation and those particles hit our atmosphere, that's what produces our beautiful aurorae. So these aurorae are stunning, and we see them at the poles because the polar regions of the planet is where those particles can actually get into the magnetic field. And that, beautiful green glow is coming from the atoms in our atmosphere, the molecules getting ionized and splitting apart. So absolutely stunning, but definitely showing us that we live near an active star. But of course, this is not a huge deal. It ionizes some fraction of the gas in our atmosphere, but it's really tiny and we get to see beautiful lights and we still get to exist here as humans. There is a historical event that is recorded from the sun. It's what's called the Carrington event, which happened back in 1859. And this was a particularly extreme flare and coronal mass ejection that hit Earth's magnetosphere. That's the region of our planet that's surrounded by a magnetic field, and it's supposed to have caused the largest geomagnetic storm on record. The data from this is not really great because it happened in 1859, back when, our best observations were drawing the pattern of sunspots. So this is a drawing by Carrington of the sunspots that were observed on the surface of the sun at the time that this giant coronal mass ejection happened. And it's predicted that today, if a similar solar storm happened, it would cause widespread electrical disruptions and potentially just electrical blackouts, because it would ionize so much of our atmosphere, so much radiation and charged particles would have hit the atmosphere that we wouldn't have any of our telecommunications. Okay, so fortunately this happened in 1859 and nothing so big has happened since. An interesting test case to look at in our own solar system is actually Mars, because Mars is also a planet that is in the quote unquote habitable zone of our sun, but Mars at this point has no atmosphere at all. And we think that that happened because Mars is a slightly smaller planet. And so Mars cooled down a lot from its kind of initial heat of formation, and it lost its magnetic field as a result. And so Mars has no magnetic field at all, and as a result, its entire atmosphere has basically been eroded away. These are images, data taken by the MAVEN spacecraft that's been observing Mars's atmospheric escape. And it's showing carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And essentially you can see this glow on the sort of right-hand side of each of these images. That is detections of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that are getting blasted out on one side of the planet. So the sun is kind of over here on the left side of the screen, and the stream of energy and particles coming from the sun is impacting Mars, and then it's stripping these atoms off on the opposite side of the planet. You can kind of see what that looks like in this model that's shown on the right. This is kind of a model to fit this data, showing the energy from the sun hitting the planet, and then the atmosphere of the planet getting stripped away on the right-hand side. So we are very lucky on Earth because we have a nice magnetic field which protects our atmosphere, but Mars is kind of a different test case because it lost its entire atmosphere just because our sun is an active star and it didn't have a magnetic field to protect it. Okay, so I wanted to say all of that to kind of motivate what this looks like from our habitability standpoint sitting here on Earth, right? We so far are the only habitable planet with life on it that we know of in the universe. And so a lot of what we think about when we think about astrobiology and life in the universe comes from an Earth-centered viewpoint. But what we really want to know is there life elsewhere? So we want to take what we learn from Earth and then apply it to other places in the universe. So far, we have discovered just over 4,000 exoplanets, and those are planets orbiting stars that are not our sun. So they are orbiting stars elsewhere in our Milky Way galaxy. This is showing a chart of how those different types of planets are detected. We have a whole bunch of different techniques we use to detect and characterize exoplanets. But 4,000 planets. And I always think it's astounding just to take a moment and appreciate that number, because we did not know that there were planets other than in our solar system until the 1990s. So within my lifetime, we have gone from thinking that our solar system was it, that we were the only star with planets around it in the solar system, let alone in the universe, to knowing that there's at least 4,000 planets elsewhere in just our galaxy. So this is a field and an understanding of our universe that has just changed dramatically in only the last couple of decades. Okay, what do those exoplanets look like? These is a nice little graphic from the Kepler mission. So Kepler was a mission specifically to detect exoplanets. And what this is showing is the dashed lines are our solar system. So we can see the orbits of the inner planets here. And then these are our outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, to scale. And so all of the little smaller orbits here are individual exoplanet systems that we now know about. The size of the circles is showing you the size of the planets. So things that are big are Jupiter sized, things that are small are maybe Earth or Mercury sized. And the color is showing you the equilibrium temperature of those planets. So things that are blue have nice Earth-like temperatures. possibly habitable. Things that are red are really close to their host star and are really hot. They're the temperature of lava. So I always like to show this, and there's several things you can take away from this. One, wow, so many planets, right? And we know a lot about them. Two, none of these planets look like our solar system. What is going on, right? All of these planets are orbiting much closer to their stars than our planets are in our solar system. And there's a huge kind of range of other things going on here. We have a lot of really big planets, a lot of really hot planets, lots of things that don't really seem like good places to look for life as we know it. But there are a few, right? There's some of these that are on wider orbits that are nice, maybe small planets that have more temperate temperatures. So there are certainly places to look. And that is what we are trying to understand now. Okay, now I'm going to tie all of these pieces back together and say that more than 70% of the stars in our galaxy are M dwarfs. So these are those spectral types that I talked about before. Our sun is a G-type star. O-type stars are brighter stars. M-type stars are these fainter, cooler stars. And this last column is showing you the percentage of stars in our galaxy that are that spectral type star. So stars like our sun make up roughly 7% of the stars in our galaxy. It's not rare, but it's also not the most common. 75% of the stars in our galaxy are M dwarfs. So when you look at these beautiful exoplanet systems, right, you can therefore say about 75% of them are surrounding these M dwarf stars. And most of them are not surrounding stars that look like our sun at all. So we're really looking at habitable planets around M dwarfs, because that is just what the numbers work out to be. The other thing to note is that M dwarfs are just way more active than our sun. I told you about aurorae and Mars and the Carrington event, and that's all great. But M dwarfs flare orders of magnitude, 100 times, 1,000 times more energetic than our sun. And whereas our sun might do that once in a half every century, M dwarfs do that on an almost daily basis. So it completely changes the picture of what we're looking for when we try and understand life in the universe. So what I'm going to be showing you a lot of today is some new work that I've been doing with my research group, where we've been studying Proxima Centauri. And this was a nice article that came out in the New York Times about our work, and I really like it because it frames it in this great way, right? It frames it in trying to ask, from our perspective on Earth, what the space weather season is going to look like, in the next 10 years from our sun. And it points out the fact that, our sun is just boring. It's not a particularly interesting star, and that is very much in our favor. Whereas, all of these stars and all of these planets that we're looking at as astronomers trying to look for life in the universe are completely different. It's a completely different environment. Things are just orders of magnitude more active, and we really have to start kind of thinking about what that means for the possibility of life on these planets. Okay, so I will, narrow this down into one question, which is, what does habitability mean on an M dwarf planet? And to try and get at that, we use astronomical observations. So for those of you who might not be familiar with it, this is the electromagnetic spectrum, which is the entire spectrum of light. What we can see as humans is visible light, which is this tiny little rainbow patch here. That's all the light that we can see. But light actually spans a much wider range of wavelength and frequency space. So wavelength is defining the distance between the peaks of our light wave. So we can go to the long wavelength side, where we go into the infrared, which is heat, right? And I'm a warm body here, and as I sit here, I radiate heat. That's the infrared part of the spectrum, which we can't see. We can also go out in the radio, things like your microwave oven or your radio, all are light waves as well. And we can go to the other end, which is shorter wavelengths, where we're seeing things like the ultraviolet and X-rays. When you have an X-ray at the doctor, that is a different wavelength of light, all the way out to our most energetic, shortest wavelength light, which is gamma rays over here on the right-hand side of the clock. So we as astronomers have the electromagnetic spectrum essentially as our toolkit. We can go out and we can take observations with different telescopes, and we can probe different parts of the spectrum. Different parts of the spectrum probe different physics, and so we can learn different things about astronomical objects. And when a star flares, it flares across that entire spectrum. It's not flaring in any one little patch of that, it's flaring across the entire thing. And so if we really want to understand flares, we need to look at all parts of the spectrum. And I love this graphic. This is actually our own sun, and it's a pretty narrow range in wavelength, but you can see that in each of these images, which is a different part of that spectrum, this flare looks completely different. In some of them, it looks like a nice loop. In some of them, it's very extended. And so clearly, different wavelengths of light are tracing different things. And so we want to get this sort of multi-wavelength picture to really better our understanding of stellar activity. Okay, now one tool that I use a lot, and I'm going to show you a bunch of observations from, as Regina already said in my introduction, is ALMA, or the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. And ALMA is built down in the Chilean Atacama Desert. So this is showing ALMA. It's an array of 66 radio antennas. And they're actually reconfigurable. You can move them around. And it's a completely astounding telescope. It's built at 5,000 meters, which is just over 17,000 feet of elevation. There's 66 antennas. You can space them anywhere from 150 meters apart to greater than 16 kilometers apart. And so you can actually pick up these antennas and drive them across the desert and put them different distances. It operates over a huge wavelength range. And you can see ALMA is located right here in this little red box, sort of right at the edge of Chile, near Bolivia and Paraguay. Bolivia and Argentina, sorry. So this is kind of a closer look at it. These are a cartoon picture of the antenna. It's divided into these two subarrays. This is the little caterpillar that actually drives under and picks up an antenna and then drives it across the desert. So essentially moving these antennas around is just kind of scooping one up and driving it for hours across the Chilean desert. And I always like to show this to kind of give you a sense of scale. So if you took all of those 66 antennas and you put them as close as possible, those 150-meter baselines, all of the antennas would fit on the ellipse of the White House. And if you put them as far apart as possible, all of them would span across the Washington Beltway. This is a DC-centric view because I made this slide when I was still living in DC, but it applies very nicely. So the Beltway is this highway that runs around the outskirts of Washington, DC, and it's big. It surrounds the entire city. And so you could take all those antennas and you could have them span the entirety of the Washington, DC metro area, or cram them all on the White House front lawn. Okay, so that's what we want to know and the toolkit that we're going to use to understand it. And this is the object that I've been focusing on as kind of the test case to really try and understand what role stellar activity plays in planetary habitability. So Proxima Centauri is our closest neighbor in our galaxy. It is one of these M-type stars. It's very cool, very small. It's about 1 parsec away. In light years, that's 4 light years. So it's close. And Proxima Centauri has 2 known exoplanets around it. One of them is a planet that's just a little bit bigger than our Earth, and it is sitting right smack in the habitable zone of the planet. So that is kind of our best test case planet, right? It is possibly habitable. It could be at the right temperature for liquid water, and it's close, so we can really study it. There's a second planet that's a bit larger, 6 times the Earth's mass, and it's sitting a bit further out. So it's outside of the habitable zone, but still it's a system with 2 different planets in it. Now, I got interested in the system because there was a claim made back in 2017 that there were also a system of dust rings in this disk. So we have the asteroid in the Kuiper Belt in our solar system, which is leftover debris from our planet's formation. And these observations from ALMA were claiming that they had detected a similar system of asteroid and Kuiper Belt around Proxima Centauri. Okay, so that's really interesting. So I downloaded this data because I wanted to take a look at it. And what I'm showing in the left panel here is all of that data just imaged all together. In total, they had taken 13 observations. So each observation is about an hour. So they had taken about 13 hours of data. And if you image them all together, there's a star here. It has a flux to it. It's bright. It has some emission around it. Not too exciting. What was very puzzling was that I took the first 12 observations the first 12 hours of data, and I image those separately. And if you do that, these images don't look the same, right? There's no emission from the star here, or almost none at all. If you take just the last hour of data, that 13th observation, there's this hugely bright point source. So clearly, whatever I'm seeing here in this average image is varying over time. And we can actually look at it on a finer time scale than that. We can look at the individual integrations from the telescope, which are about a second in length. And if you do that, then you see that not only is there not signal in these first 12 hours, but there's not even signal from the star in most of this 13th observation. There's actually only about 2 minutes where the star is detected by the telescope. It's below the noise level, and then it goes through this series of small flares where the star is kind of hiccuping. And then it has this gigantic outburst, and then it fades away. And the entire event only lasts about 2 minutes. So this is bad news for the dust rings, because it pretty much means that there's no reason to believe that there is dust in the system at all. But it was very exciting because it was the first time we'd actually seen emission at this wavelength from a star while it was flaring. And millimeter observations are really exciting because we can actually learn more about the physics of the star, the physics of what's producing this flare, by looking at the millimeter observations. So a few kind of facts about this particular flare. At its brightest, this flare was about 1,000 times brighter than the star is when it's not flaring. So the star brightened by a factor of about 1,000. If we compare that to the sun, it's about 10 times brighter than the brightest solar flares we'd ever seen at similar wavelengths. And it had some peculiar properties in what we call the polarization and the spectral index. So light, when we see it here, is unpolarized. The waves are propagating in any direction. There's no preferred direction. Sometimes an astrophysical source or magnetic field causes light to have a preferred direction. So more of the light is traveling all in the same pattern. When we detect that, we say the light is polarized. And so with ALMA, we can actually measure that. And you can see that we go from not being polarized to having this kind of indication that something has happened in the star where the light now has a preferred direction that it's traveling. The spectral index tells us how the flux of the star, the brightness, varies with frequency across that electromagnetic spectrum. And changes in that mean that something else is producing the emission. So this is showing, our flare happening, right? And as the flare happens, something's changing in the properties of the emission. It's becoming polarized, and this, spectral index is changing as the flare happens. So we're really sort of getting into the physics of what's going on with this event. Okay, so that was exciting, but it was just one flare. Like, what can you learn with one event? So I went back and tried to conduct this multi-wavelength campaign to really understand stellar flaring as a whole. And so what we did was to get 8 different telescopes from the ground to space and all across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So we have everything from ALMA, which is this radio telescope. We have a whole suite of optical telescopes, both on the ground and in space. We have the Hubble Space Telescope looking in the ultraviolet, and SWIFT and Chandra looking in the X-ray. We took all these 8 telescopes and we stared at Proxima Centauri simultaneously. So all the telescopes were staring at the star at the exact same time for about 40 hours between April and July, about 2 years ago in 2019. I will note that multi-wavelength observing campaigns like this are hard because you're trying to take 8 different telescopes all over the world and point them at the same object, and inevitably stuff goes wrong. So I like to show this graphic of all the nights we were observing, and green means like solid, everything went great. Red means either we weren't trying that night or something went awry, something broke. Some of these are because it snowed at ALMA. One night there was a power outage, HST was having some issues at that point. And so stuff happens, but we got a whole lot of data where we managed to stare at the star with the same suite of telescopes across the entire electromagnetic spectrum for hours. And the results we're getting out of this are really exciting. So we published our first paper, which is what that New York Times article was coming from, just a month or 2 ago. And we detected the largest flare we'd ever seen from Proxima Centauri with ALMA and Hubble. So this is a light curve. It's showing the brightness of the star as a function of time, and there's a bunch of subpanels, so I'll sort of walk you through them. This left panel on the upper part here is showing in wavelength order all the telescopes that we're observing and caught this flare. So we have ALMA, TESS, which is the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. It's an optical telescope in space. The DuPont telescope at Las Campanas, which is an optical telescope on the ground, and the Hubble Space Telescope. This right panel is actually just zooming in on just ALMA and Hubble together, so you can see them together. And this bottom panel is showing a different radio telescope in Australia that we actually were able to catch some time with at the same time as this flare as well. Now, in the Hubble data, this flare brightens by a factor of 14,000. So the star increases its brightness by 14,000. And the entire event lasts for about 7 seconds. So in 7 seconds, Proxima Centauri goes from one level to 14,000 times brighter and back down to its normal quiescent level, like that. What's really interesting is that we can actually start to see how different wavelengths of light behave relative to each other. So ALMA and Hubble trace each other perfectly. They look like they're in lockstep the entire time. The optical emission is doing something completely different. It's actually pretty delayed, right? You can see this is where the ALMA and the Hubble event happens, and this is where the optical light peaks. So the optical light is actually delayed by several minutes, all coming from the same flaring event. And we think that means that the UV and the radio are tracing higher up in the stellar atmosphere, and the optical data is actually coming from deeper in the stellar atmosphere. So that delay is actually a delay in light travel time from the lower part of the atmosphere to the upper part of the atmosphere. The gold standard for trying to understand atmospheric impacts is to use these UV observations, because UV light is what is kind of most damaging to life on Earth and our atmosphere. But it's hard, to use Hubble, and Hubble is aging, as I'm sure many have seen in the news. Hubble is currently shut down because it's having some issues. And so this is actually really intriguing because it suggests that we could use radio telescopes like ALMA on the ground to get at the same information. Because if they trace each other that closely, maybe we can just learn about atmospheric impacts just by using these radio telescopes, and we don't necessarily need Hubble. Okay. This is showing again that same plot, trying to look at the properties in the radio. And so we're sort of building up a sample now of different M-Dwarf flares. And what's interesting is if you just look at these light curves, they all look really similar. They show these very similar properties. They have the same sort of change in polarization, change in spectral index. And they're all really short flares. These are times in seconds. So these events are anywhere from 30 seconds to maybe 7 seconds in length. Really kind of hammering home that the optical data is doing something weird. This is what we call a flare frequency distribution. So it plots the number of flares versus their amplitude, their total brightening, or their energy release. So bigger flares are over on the right side of these plots, and smaller flares are over on the left. And so smaller flares from Proxima occur, every day. Bigger flares occur less frequently. The green line is where that flare is in the optical. So I told you it's the brightest flare we've ever seen from Hubble, brightening by 14,000. But in the optical, it's got almost no emission at all. It actually is so small that we would expect a flare of that amplitude to occur every day on Proxima Centauri. So there's clearly some differences between these wavelengths that we've been missing up until now by not looking in this kind of multi-wavelength way. Another thing that's cool is Hubble can actually take spectra, so we can look at individual lines, different elements in the star that are responding to the flaring event. And so in blue is the spectrum of the star, while it's not doing anything exciting. And in orange is now the flaring spectrum of the star. So you can see all of these cool lines. Some of them are like carbon and silicon, these lines that we never see from stars ever, picking up and brightening by huge amounts while this flare happens. Okay, I want to highlight a few things that some of my students have been working on. So that's one event, and we observe for 40 hours. So I just showed you one event that lasted for 7 seconds, but we have all of these other data to dig through. And so Anna Estes did her undergrad honors thesis with me this past year. She found another flare on a different day, and this is a multi-wavelength plot of that flare. And we're actually, detecting so many flares that we can start making these sort of flare frequency distributions. Again, frequency of flares as a function of brightening for other wavelengths. So we can start really looking at the distribution and energies of flares and inform that into atmospheric models and what that would do to Proxima Centauri b, our potentially habitable exoplanet. This is a really cool video that my summer student this summer, Alejandro, who's working with me through the Mariah Mitchell RU this summer, made. This is AU-MIC, which is a totally different M star, but we also detect a flare from this star, and you can actually see this video, which shows the star brightening and then dimming back down. And so this is stepping through, this light curve, which is showing, brightening time. So you can see as you walk through this, the star goes from nothing and then goes up this curve and then reaches a peak before sort of fading back down. And then there's the second little flare that happens right about here and then goes back down. So we're starting to detect these events from other stars that are not just Proxima Centauri. And some of those stars are stars like our sun. So my graduate student last summer, Kiana, is working on a paper right now. She dug through some ALMA data and found several flares in the millimeter data coming from a star that's just like our sun called Epsilon Eridani. And this is another really interesting sun-like star that also has a flare happening in the ALMA data. This one, by chance, we caught with both ALMA and TESS. Not even timed it, but TESS just happened to be looking at the star at the same time as we were looking at it with ALMA. Okay, so we're learning a lot about stellar flares. And to kind of wrap up my talk, I wanted to sort of zoom back out, right? I asked these big questions at the beginning and then we narrowed in on one piece. And I want to take us back out to the bigger picture, because distance from the star is only one factor that we might care about when we talk about planetary habitability, right? We want to know whether that planet has a magnetic field. On our Earth, our plate tectonics are really important for atmospheric cycling. We want to know how big the planet is and whether it's rotating. We want to know what volatiles it has in its atmosphere. Does it have an atmosphere at all, right? And so there's all these different pieces that we need to get at. And so I really think that we're sort of slowly moving to this bigger picture astrobiology work. We need to take what we've learned about stellar activity and we need to feed it into these other parts of trying to understand planets, right? So I have the star and it flares. What is it doing to that exoplanet? Is it eroding that atmosphere? Could it change the composition of that atmosphere? And if I look at the life on that planet, is that radiation from the flare enough to actually damage, say nucleic acid-based life, DNA-based life on a planet? Another way of looking at that is maybe that's bad, but maybe it's good. Maybe having flaring like this activity from the star can actually, force the bios bond. So there's, a parable of a place called Daisy World, which is a planet covered in daisies, and the daisies actually change from white to black. They change their color in response to changes in the brightness from the star. And so maybe, we're being too narrow by thinking of Earth-like life. Maybe we need to think bigger and think about how, these sorts of events might actually cause a biosphere on our planet to self-regulate instead of just having itself be destroyed by, nucleic acid damage from nasty flares. So I think, oh, and one more thing, here, right, this is trying to think about, I've been starting a larger collaboration to try and understand where planets even get their atmospheres in the first place and what is that atmospheric composition, and trying to trace, how volatiles come from these large molecular clouds are inherited into planets through planet formation and then are processed by what's happening around that planet, the star, the stellar activity, what's going on, as we kind of try and get to the point where we're going to be soon able to actually take observations of exoplanets and measure their atmospheric compositions. And we want to know and understand what that means and how we can look for biosignatures in exoplanet atmospheres. So I think we're really moving to this exciting part of science where we're not just astronomers, but we're thinking of astronomers, and we're thinking of geology, and we're thinking of biology, and we're really trying to put together the pieces of planetary systems. Certainly not something I ever thought I would be doing. If you'd asked me a decade ago whether I would be learning about biology and DNA damage, I would have said, what are you talking about, right? But we've gotten to the point in this field where we have the data to be able to ask these questions and really actually start to tie those pieces together. And I just think that's really exciting. So I will put up this summary slide and say, you know, if you take a few things away, stellar activity plays an absolutely critical role in the ability of a planet to sort of keep its atmosphere and support life, or at least life as we know it on Earth. These flares, the space weather, can really damage atmospheres, and it could potentially damage life. And so we need to understand it better if we want to think about habitability on exoplanets. And we're learning a lot as we get new observations and new telescopes. But it's important to keep in mind that it's only one factor that actually impacts the habitability of planets. And so we really need to kind of think bigger, right? We need to start thinking outside of the box and looking across traditional boundaries to try and, you know, really get answers to these questions. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I can hear all of the applause out there. That was awesome. Very inspiring talk. And let's see, I'll just say, yes, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them into the Q&A. We have a couple. The first one is from Maya, and she's wondering, how do they measure the temperature around the stars to establish where the habitable zone is?
That is an excellent question. And the key is we don't actually measure it. We interpret and assume, basically. So we know that the star is a given brightness, and then that star is putting out a certain amount of radiation, and we can calculate like how that radiation falls off as you get farther away from the star. And then essentially we assume that the planet is like Earth. It's a rocky surface with an Earth-sized atmosphere, and we can calculate, you know, if it gets that much radiation, how hot will that planet be? And so that is entirely computational. We do not actually have a way of like measuring the temperature of any exoplanets.
Great. Okay, our next question is from Bob, and he's asking, could you describe a bit about the time evolution of what happens on the star during a flare? You show millimeter flares that flash for less than a minute. Other similar stars, for example, AD Leo, show flares in optical spectra that have rapid rise, like 5 minutes, and then a long fade, about 30 minutes or longer, to fade back to non-flare brightness.
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. I'll just quickly scooch back to the light curve so I have something to refer to as I talk this through. So the general picture we have of flares kind of across the board is that these magnetic field lines thread through the surface of the star, and the star is convecting, so the surface is moving around. And so these foot points where the magnetic field lines hit the surface of the star move. And as they move, the whole line above it twists up. And so eventually that snaps, and you get what's called a reconnection, where this kind of nasty twist of things snaps, and you end up with just a smooth loop structure. And so the flare is the radiation release, the energy release that's coming from that snapping. And you're seeing that light get basically spiraled around this magnetic field flow and then ejected out into space. So you're right that a lot of other stars that we've looked at previously for flares have very large events, and some of them are really quite long. And so what often gets invoked is this idea of an arcade, where instead of having just one loop that's snapped and broken, you actually have a whole chain of loops. And so what you're seeing from the extended emission is actually kind of this whole arcade, just like, you know, I knocked a domino down and like the entire domino of loops goes and breaks. This event is really notable because it is so short. We have never seen a flare like this energetic, but also this short. And so it suggests that, you know, maybe there's different pictures and different mechanisms, right? Where some of these flares, we see this arcade structure, maybe something like this, we're only seeing one loop break. The delay in the emission then we think is coming from, the fact that we see this polarization in the radio light indicates it's getting spiraled around these loops. And so perhaps the radio and the UV are getting spiraled around the upper part of this loop structure. So we see it first. And the optical is actually coming from the heating that happens at the foot points down at the surface of the star where that magnetic field loop comes into the photosphere of the surface. And so the delay is then actually coming from this travel time difference. We're seeing this sort of snapping, high energy radiation that we see in the millimeter and the UV, and that hits us first, and then this heating lower down is coming later. But I think in general, we haven't had that much multi-wavelength data of stellar flares, which is astounding to me. It's hard to get, and so we just haven't actually had this picture before. And as always in astronomy, the better data and the more data you get, the more complicated it is, right? And so I suspect, we have much more to learn about flares, and there's probably different mechanisms and different types of flares that have different signatures, and we just haven't been probing that before.
That's really awesome. I'm going to actually ask a follow-up question based on what you just described. Does that model or theory that you just described, where the optical comes from, sort of the base of this flare, also explain why the optical might be not only delayed, but is it also longer? I guess I have a two-part question. Is the optical flaring also usually a longer, or are we limited by the optical observation here, for example, being just it was a longer integration or something? And so that's a
so a lot of the optical flares are longer, and this flare definitely is longer. So like this plot is showing the X error bars here, actually the duration of the scan, because we have different time resolutions with different telescopes. So ALMA and HST, we can look down to the second. In TESS here, which is optical, we can look to 2 minutes, and these are spectroscopic observations. So we had to look at, 12 minutes or something. So they're big integrations, but you can see that they actually don't pick up at first with this first burst, and it's elevated for several 12-minute integrations afterwards. So it's kind of going up and then slowly tailing away over like 45 minutes. So it does last quite a bit longer. And yes, I mean, if you really detangle those emission mechanisms, right, you would expect maybe this sort of spiraling fast release of radiation to be fast, whereas this kind of lower level heating might last for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Cool, that's great. Let's see, the Astro interns have some questions. First of all, what is the purpose of moving the radio telescopes closer and further apart?
Yeah, so that's a resolution, because interferometry is radio astronomy's answer to I want really beautiful high resolution images of things, and I want to build a 16-kilometer telescope, but I can't build a 16-kilometer telescope, right? It's physically impossible. So instead of building one giant dish, you take 66 antennas and you spread them out over the spacing of your would-be giant dish, and then you correlate the signals, and it works exactly the same as if you were to build this giant 16-kilometer dish. So by changing the spacing, you actually change, right? So this is just like a telescope. The resolution goes as 1 over the diameter of the telescope. So if you change the diameter of the telescope, you change the resolution, and you sort of change what you can image well. And so it's not obvious when looking at these stars because they're just unresolved point sources, and I don't care what the resolution of the telescope is. But when we look at things like disks forming around stars, which is a lot of what my research group works on as well, then you want really high resolution in order to actually see the structure and the gaps in these disks that might be caused by planets.
Mm-hmm. Another question from them is, why do M-dwarf stars flare more strongly and more often than other types of stars?
Yeah, so that is a good question. We think that the reason is M-dwarfs are smaller, right? So M-dwarfs are roughly maybe 10% the size of our sun. And so you've gotten this really tiny star. And in our sun has an internal structure where there's a core, where hydrogen is actually fused into helium, and that's what powers the sun. And then there's what's called a radiative layer, where that, energy that's released from that fusion reaction just streams outwards. And then there's this outer layer of convection that happens, where we actually have convective currents like we have in our atmosphere that produce all the thunderstorms that are happening everywhere in the summer. So that's what the sun looks like. M dwarfs, because they're smaller, actually don't have that middle radiative layer. The entire star is convective in some of these stars. And so that, we think, leads them to have this much stronger magnetic field, because the entire star is convecting. And so you end up having just a much stronger magnetic field, and then having a stronger magnetic field, because there's clearly a tie between magnetic field and activity, leads you to having a more active star.
Awesome. Let's see. We have lots of thank yous for an amazing presentation. I actually have one more question I'd like to ask you, which is, I'm sure that you are, so I won't ask if you are anticipating the launch of JWST. I'll phrase it as, what will JWST, what are you hoping to do with JWST if you had all the time in the world?
Good question. Yeah, so from like an exoplanet habitability standpoint, I think there's like two really interesting things that it will do. One is more directly related to what I just talked about, which is that we'll actually get the first compositional measurements of some exoplanets. So, the JWST can take spectra, and we hope and think that it can take spectra of these nearby exoplanets. And so for the first time, you could go to Proxima Centauri b and look directly at the atmosphere of the exoplanet and try and detect what's in the atmosphere. And so, right now I'm making a lot of assumptions that this is an Earth-like atmosphere, but I have no idea what the composition of the atmosphere is, and we don't really have a way to tell that. But with something like JWST, you start to, for large planets, actually be able to identify things like CO2 and methane and oxygen, and get a rough atmospheric composition. And then we can ask all these interesting questions about, how do we tell if there's a biosignature or not? Like, what combination of things would we detect that might indicate that there is life on that planet? How do we tease that out from just, what the planet inherited in the first place? Mm-hmm. I also think JWST is going to do some really interesting stuff from planet formation, which is kind of the other side of my research, where we're actually be able to detect those sorts of molecules in the disks themselves, and then try and get at the other side of this. How does that material get inherited into planets in the first place, and what is the composition that those planets are forming out of? Mm-hmm. So fingers crossed and launch. Yes. And opens up beautifully, and it's fine.
Yes, this will be a nerve-wracking month or two, but yeah. Let's see, we have one more question from the astro interns who are wondering, do flares on the sun change its brightness enough to be detectable from far away? Like if we were observing the sun from Proxima Centauri, or are they too weak?
That's an excellent question. I'd say the answer is yes, depending upon how far away you are, right? As always.
Yeah, and what you're
I would imagine that the aliens who may or may not exist on Proxima Centauri could probably turn a telescope towards our sun and detect some of the flares that happen from the sun. The sun doesn't have big events that frequently, but we detect these flares from Epsilon Eridani, and that is a sun-like star. It's a bit younger than our sun, but we can see those from here, and that's 3 parsecs away. So the reverse should be true as well, I would think. The main difference, which is actually why it's hard to compare the two, is that when we look at the sun, right, we see the resolved disk of the star, and so we can actually see the events happening in different places and their structure. And when we look at a star, we just see a single pixel that changes its brightness, right? And we have no idea where that's coming from on the star. Are we seeing it like behind the limb of the star and it was actually brighter? Are we seeing it face on? Like, where is it associated with? And so that makes it actually really hard to compare solar observations and stellar observations, because they're just kind of like 2 completely different animals.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting to think about, though. Great question. Great. Well, we have gone a little bit past the hour, and I don't see any other questions. So I think I will thank you again for this really, really amazing talk. And we have lots of thanks coming in the chat and the Q&A from the audience. And we really, really, really enjoyed having you here. And so thank you for sharing your work and your time with us. And to everybody who's attended, I'll just thank you for being here. Tune in next week, same time, same place. We'll have a special speaker, Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, who will be talking about dark matter. And it should be a very interesting talk. So I'd encourage you all to register for that and attend. And with that, I'll say thank you again, Meredith, and thank you all for attending. And one more final note, I just remembered, if you missed anything or came in late to the talk, we will be posting this talk on our YouTube channel tomorrow or the next day, so you can catch it and rewatch it there. So thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Good night.
Bye.